Good evening, everyone. My name is John Bartlett, and on behalf of the Geelong Regional Library Corporation, I'd like to welcome you to the library's author event this evening. The Geelong Regional Library Corporation acknowledges the Wadawurrung and the Eastern Maar original owners of the lands on which our library services operate. We pay respect to the Wadawurrung and the Eastern Maar elders, past, present, and emerging. And we acknowledge and celebrate the First Nations peoples of this land as the custodians of the learning, literacy, knowledge, and the story. And it looks like we have about 80 people here tonight, and welcome everybody. That's a good turn up. Thank you. And just a couple of housekeeping reminders before we actually start. You can participate in the live webinar this evening by clicking on the Q&A button and typing your question or comment. You may need to touch the screen to see the Q&A and chat functions if you're using an iPad or an iPhone to join us tonight. And if you want to watch this discussion again or recommend to friends or family, you can watch it on the library's website from tomorrow. And tonight, I have the great pleasure of introducing author Charlotte Wood. Charlotte is the prize-winning author of 6 novels and 2 books of non-fiction. And her latest book, The Weekend, is a novel about friendship and growing older, and about other things, I think, as well. We'll soon find out. And it was recently awarded the Australian Book Industry Awards Literary Book of the Year for 2020. So welcome, Charlotte, and congratulations on the award.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's lovely to be doing this. Very exciting to be doing it live, which is yeah, fun.
Yes.
John's done an amazing job of getting it all prepared. So
well,
thank you, everyone.
We'll see how the evening goes. Now, as I said, that you're the author of 6 novels and 2 books of non-fiction. I just, before talking about The Weekend, I wanted to just talk a little bit about your previous book, The Natural Way of Things, which was a prize winner too, but won a number of prizes, the 2016 Stella Prize, the 2016 Indie Book of the Year, and the Novel of the Year, and it was joint winner of the Prime Minister's Literary Award for 2016. Just comparing the 2 books, it would seem that they're very different books. They're both books about women, very different, but do you see any similarities between them yourself?
Good question. I tend to think of them as very different books because I felt very differently when I was writing them. I guess, you know, if there's a similarity, it might be about women's preoccupation with not being boxed into certain stereotypes or expectations to do with, well, just the way that, you know, women through the ages have been, you know, their destinies controlled by the patriarchy, I suppose. So the women in The Weekend, obviously, they're much older. The Natural Way of Things is about young women. This is about older women. But they are sort of all fighting for their own, the independence of their own souls and minds, I suppose. So maybe that's where I would see a similarity. Otherwise, tonally and
yes,
story-wise and everything, they're quite different.
Totally different. The Natural Way of Things is a very difficult book to read. I imagine quite a difficult book to write too. How did it affect you, the writing of it?
Yeah, it was a very tough book to write, and partly because I never would have planned to write a book like that. So The Natural Way of Things, for people who don't know, it is about misogyny, and it's set in a kind of weird, slightly surreal outback sort of prison for young women who've spoken out against sexual assault in some public sort of scandal. So I was writing it for 3 years, which meant really kind of dwelling in some very dark material, both from the real world and in my imagination. And sometimes it felt, I think old novelists would say that when you're imagining something with all of your senses, and you sort of try and inhabit the people and the place that you're in the book, you kind of do, it does stuff to your physical self and your mental state. It kind of has to in order to do it properly. But you know, at the end of each day, I was able to go out and have a nice dinner with my husband and see my friends and all of that. So, but in a, you know, in a kind of imaginative way, I guess I did sometimes feel very claustrophobic, and also dwelling in that material of thinking about, you know, really horrible misogyny it's not a nice way to spend 3 years. So, and then, you know, 3 years talking about it as well, and then published internationally and going and speaking about it over there and so on. So I was very ready to get away from that sort of darkness in moving into this book.
Here I am asking you about it again. But I know our brief is to talk about the weekend, but before we leave, I did want to just said something, I think it was in your Stella Prize speech, about the reasons that you write. And one of them, I think you said, was make something beautiful. And I think you sort of answered what I'm going to ask you a bit in a way. You said beauty does not have to be, didn't mean prettiness. What was the beauty about the natural way of things that you wanted to write about?
Well, there were kind of a few different forms, I suppose. One of them was that I did kind of try and pour in a lot of beauty in terms of the landscape and the kind of the redemptive power of nature, which I really thoroughly believe in for myself in the real world and imaginatively in that book. But also, I guess when I was in the speech, I meant, you know, I said it doesn't have to be about prettiness. It can be in the beauty of courage, or of attentiveness to, I mean, I didn't say this, but this is what I was alluding to, attentiveness to the fine grain of life, or just, you know, I can see a painting by someone like Francis Bacon, you know, which is very brutal and kind of confronting, but there is still beauty in it. You know, there is beauty in darkness sometimes. So I wanted to, I think when we talk about beauty, we often mean something consoling or that makes us feel better, but sometimes beautiful things can challenge us. And I think I was talking about that.
Thanks for that. We better move on to the weekend. That's what we're here for, really. But in that Stella speech, you did say some other things about the reasons that you write, and I hope we can get on to them perhaps towards the end too, because I found them very, very interesting. So ostensibly, you know, the weekend is about this group of women, and it is about, you know, the aging process and about facing death. And one of the characters, not sort of mentioned really too much in the book, has already died, and that's the reason why they're together in this weekend. So aging and death is sort of the preoccupation of the book. Do you think there's a time when we sort of start to be more aware of aging? Does it sort of happen at a certain age, do you think, or start to drop off the body and we think, oh, it reminds us about our parents getting older? Or when do we start thinking about aging, do you think?
Well, I don't know, because I think that's a really individual thing. And I once read somebody saying that, you know, old is always 10 years older than you are. So we all have different ideas of what old is. And I think when we, depending on our natures, I suppose, when we get to that age, we think, well, actually, I'm not old. That old is still a bit far off for me. But I think also for women, there's, I wrote an essay for the Griffith Review recently, and it was reprinted in The Guardian. And I started that essay by saying I was working on this book in an institution at Sydney University, and a young woman who worked there came up to me and said, and she was very attractive young woman, and she said, oh, you're writing about aging, aren't you? And I said, yes. And she said, she kind of looked at me in this quite intent way, and then she just said, I'm terrified of aging. And I sort of laughed, because it's like, yeah, maybe you won't have this trouble, you know, you might fare better in the aging process. But it was sort of, she's so young to be so terrified. Like, she used the word terrified. And I spoke about this with Virginia Trioli recently, and she said, yes, what is it? Terrified of aging. What does that mean? You know, she didn't say she was terrified of being sick or of losing her mobility or her autonomy or of changing her living. It was just this sort of spectre of the word age. So I think, you know, some people begin to be afraid of it when they're really young. I don't feel that I'm afraid of aging. Of course, I'm afraid of, you know, of the kind of vulnerabilities that will render my life, you know, too difficult to go on if that happens to me, like if I get Alzheimer's or you know, whatever. But I don't fear the fact of getting old. And in fact, you know, my parents both died in their 50s, and I'm now in my 50s, and I just feel like getting old, you know, I still feel like it probably won't happen for me. You know, I kind of match my life expectancy to my parents, like I think many of us do. So I don't know, that it's a hard one to answer. I mean, I know when, you know, sometimes you look at, but I did this when I was 30, you know, looking at yourself and going, oh my God, look at that. You know, my hands, what do they look like? So, but that's not old, you know. So you can, I think often it depends on your frame of mind too. You know, you can feel great and have the same face and body one week, and then, you know, the next week think, oh my God, I'm so old. So I think there's a lot of perception involved in that, in those judgments.
I'm glad you mentioned the Griffith review, because I just happened to have it with me this evening too, because I was reading that.
Issue.
Yes, your article though was called "Experiments in the Art of Living." But you deal with aging in that, but I couldn't quite work out where you sort of fell between sort of two extremes. There's sort of the extremes of, you know, the jolly sort of, you know, the new 80 is 70, and, you know, between, you know, rushing out and doing all sorts of things and staying young even though you're sort of 80 or 90. And the other side, you know, where the depressive sort of side. Did you sort of fall somewhere in the middle of those two?
Yeah, well, I think what I was trying to say towards the end of that essay is that why do we have to think about it only in those terms? We kind of do culturally, it seems to me, think, well, if you get old, you're either kind of almost in the denial state of, well, I'm going to walk the Camino, and I'm going to, you know, when you see stuff on like news stories about, you know, someone in their 90s on TV, it's like, this woman's 90 and she ran a marathon, or she jumped out of a plane, or she's a bodybuilder, or whatever, you know. Or it's people being abused in nursing homes and having absolutely no rights or autonomy. Or so there, yeah, I think individually we all live on a much more, you know, a much richer, you know, spectrum between those two things. But our cultural discussion about aging seems to be really at these two extremes. And I think I was saying, let's just much more explore the up and down line between those things. Like I didn't want to, and in the same in the weekend, I didn't want to be in denial about the things that do happen when you get older to your body and your mind and your sense of security and whatever. I just think it's kind of silly to deny those things, but we don't have to see them as catastrophic, you know.
But the women in the weekend are much older than you. How are you sort of able to get into their minds, or the things that sort of that they were concerned with? How were you able to sort of faithfully represent that?
Well, who knows if I did faithfully represent it, but
seems like you did.
Well, it's nice. I've had a lot of older women. A couple have said, how do you know us like this? Which I found very moving. I just imagine myself in 20 years, you know, really, and my friends and the people that I know, and also, you know, I've watched a lot of people. I know quite a few older people. I've watched people in my extended family, or just observing people on the bus or the art gallery or wherever, the way they interact with each other. I had this one fantastic moment. I was at the Art Gallery of New South Wales in the members lounge, where you can go and, you know, I often would go and write there, or you can have coffee or whatever. And it's sort of populated by quite a lot of older women. And one time I was at a table and it gets quite crowded, and these two women sort of bustled over and said, "Oh, we need to sit here, okay?" And I went, "Okay." And I was writing on my computer while they were sitting there. And then they just started having this conversation. And I was like, this is gold. You know, I literally transcribed what they were saying. And then, you know, used a fraction of it. They changed bits of it. But it was very funny to me that I didn't think I was being unethical, because they came and sat next to a woman typing on a computer.
You have confessed elsewhere, I think. Sorry, you have confessed elsewhere, I think, to being an eavesdropper like most writers, haven't you?
Oh, of course.
It's sort of fair game, I think, isn't it?
Well, you know, it's because it's never the person. You know, you take a snatch of conversation and put it with that person's walk and, you know, some memory you had about something, and by the time they all go in together, it's a new thing.
Yes, yeah. Now, we should say something probably about these three women. It's Adele, Wendy and Jude. And they've all had very interesting and terrific lives, really. They've been, you know, professional in their jobs and full lives, I suppose, really. You chose to sort of speak to have a multi-voice, like they all have their own point of view. Was there a reason why you allowed them to speak independently rather than have a sort of a one voice overall? What was that choice about?
A couple of reasons for that choice, I think. One, it was a kind of technical challenge for myself of a very shifting point of view. And quite often with the book, I'll sort of start out knowing nothing but think, I want to try doing this sort of technical thing in this book. And with this one, it was having a very mobile point of view shift. So in previous books, I might have either a whole book from one point of view, or if there's more than one sort of main-ish character, I'll have alternating chapters. So in the natural way of things, the chapters were very rhythmically alternating between Verla's point of view, Yolanda's point of view. And each chapter had their name, I think, and, you know. Whereas this, I wanted a much looser, more dynamic, shifting point of view. And one of the reasons for that was that it sort of came out as I was working. I'm not sure if I knew this from the start, but I wanted to show how three different people can see the exact same moment in utterly different ways. And part of what I hoped was the poignancy of the book is that they're continual just missing each other, you know, their misunderstandings, and they almost meet, and then one thinks, well, this is what she's doing, and the other one goes that way, you know. So they just, and I think that's what happens with us, you know, often when the way we see ourselves is not the way other people see us. And I think sometimes that is can be a great shock to us when we understand suddenly through some little or big revelation or some sort of almost gap in the curtains, we realize, oh, they don't see me the way I see myself. So that shifting point of view was very useful for allowing some of that there'd be one moment that, you know, the reader is seeing, but each of these women is kind of seeing it utterly differently.
Mm-hmm. I'd just like to sort of ask you too about talking about the influences on the writing. You said earlier that your parents died in their 50s, I think, quite young. It's quite an interesting story. I don't know if you want to tell about how they met. And I think it connects with one of your earlier books, The Submerged Cathedral, which I read many years ago. I thought it was such a fantastic book. And as a former priest, I thought you really captured that, I don't know, that dynamic between the erotic and the spiritual so beautifully.
Oh, wow.
But
Thank you very much.
Tell us that story about, I was asking at the same time whether your parents' early death did affect you in that way, to be, not to have a preoccupation with death, but sort of something that you're aware of, yeah. Can you tell us that story, perhaps, about your parents?
Yes. So my parents met when they were very young on a ship on the way to Australia. My mother was coming, they're from England. My mother was coming to Perth to work as a sort of housemaidey, childmindery type person for a family in Perth. And my father was on his way to join the Tarrawarra Monastery at Healesville to be a Trappist monk, Cistercian monk, and he had gone back to England. He'd been there, decided he wanted to do this, then went back to England and say goodbye to all his family. Then on the way on the boat back, met my mother. They fell in love on the boat, decided they had to be together, etc. And the ship was first going to Perth and then on to Melbourne. So the arrangement was that my mother would get off the ship in Perth, go and explain this to the family and apologise. She couldn't work with them. Then wait to hear from my father because he was going on to tell the monastery the same thing. Anyway, so my mother did that, and it was pretty awful because the family were not very happy with her, etc. And then a few days later, she got a letter from my father saying actually he'd changed his mind and he was going to stay at the monastery for at least a year. And obviously that was pretty devastating for my mother, who then had to go back to these people and say, oh, my new boyfriend has dumped me. Can I have my job back? Which was just humiliating. And they weren't very nice to her in general. So my father went on went to the monastery and joined up. And he, through that 1 year, they were allowed to write to each other 3 times, I think. And we've got these letters that my father wrote to my mother, which are really weird because my dad's name is John and the letters are from Brother Stephen, and they're very sort of pious and very excited about, the feast day of Saint Scholastica or something. And nothing, romantic or indicative that he was in love with her at all. Anyway, after a year, the family my mum was working for were going to Melbourne for a holiday, and she went with them, and she wrote to the prior or the abbot, I'm not sure what the proper name was, at the monastery, asking if she could visit my father, and they said yes she could. So she went to Melbourne, got on a train to Healesville, and then walked the 12 kilometres to the monastery, having arranged this appointment. And my mother was a very beautiful young woman. So we had this sort of vision of her walking through these paddocks, which she had to do. And the monks there lived a very tough life then, really. It was a silent order. They were kind of farming this land that was pretty degraded, crappy land for sheep farming. And so we just had this vision of, these monks tilling the soil and my mother sort of walking past this vision. Anyway, she arrived. She sat down with my father in a room, and as soon as he saw her, he asked her to marry him. And so that was that pretty much. And then they went and she said yes, and she probably said, I can't believe you put me through that. Off they went.
Yeah. So you're saying that it's a fantastic story, and did part of that story go into Submerged Cathedral? Not directly.
Yeah, there was. Yeah, not directly, but definitely. So there is a Trappist monk in the Submerged Cathedral, and there's a love story. And I went to Tarawara. They were very kindly welcomed me there when I was sort of thinking about that book, and I met, the abbot there had met my dad, and one of the really old monks remembered my mother showing up. So it was kind of, sort of, I don't know, legend, I suppose. And yeah, so it was about the kind of struggle between faith and commitment and love. And
we better say some more about the weekend. I wondered perhaps if you might read a bit for us, Charlotte. Page 34, where the location where the story happens over this weekend, it's one of those little seaside little towns that, well, it's hard to you describe them so well, I think, in that paragraph. Even here on the Surf Coast, we know all about those little towns, and we've seen them change over the years. And I think you really put your finger on it with that little description. Wouldn't mind reading that for us? Okay,
of course. So this town in my book is called Bittos, and it's one of those sort of coastal, I guess, playgrounds of the middle classes. That was a fishing village. A bit of it still is, but yeah, this will probably sum it up. Now the Bitto's populace existed in two cultures with a shared illusion of honest simplicity. City bankers and surgeons and copyright lawyers who liked to pretend they didn't care about money would flirt with the barmaids at the little weatherboard ex-servicemen's club, mixing it with the fishermen who smoked too much dope and made bawdy jokes decades out of date. The old hippie types, the long-timers, would shake their heads wryly at how mad the land values had gone since they first bought the shack. They liked to reminisce about dragging coolers of ice up four or five flights of stairs before the glass elevators and home-delivered groceries, or the era when you couldn't get round to Duskies except by boat. But for all this nostalgia, Bitto's had grown into a short-term and anonymous place. It was a place of expensive come-and-go weekend rentals, a destination for casual assignations, a place where groups of couples holidayed together until either the friendships or the marriages, or both at once, imploded.
Thanks, Charlotte. I think our listeners will recognise those locations around the Surf Coast and Bellarine Peninsula particularly. Thank you for that. I'm interested in the different influences on the weekend, and I understand that you also worked as a writer in residence at the Charles Perkins Centre for some time. Now, the Charles Perkins Centre is a medical research centre, I believe, part of the University of Sydney. What was a writer in residence doing hanging around with scientists and doctors?
Well, having an amazing time. So the Charles Perkins Centre, which of course is named for the brilliant, radical Aboriginal activist, political activist, Charlie Perkins. And they named the place after him because of his challenging of established boundaries and mores and spoke truth to power. So the reason that the Charles Perkins Centre exists is to bring together people from all different disciplines to address chronic health, chronic disease and ill health. So it's full-on science research facility, but it also has so it has, you know, biologists and zoologists and every kind of ologist in the science world. But it also has economists and historians and ethnographers and philosophers, and they wanted a creative writer in residence to just be there and brush up against the scientists and just see what happens. So it's a really incredible place because their reasoning is that everything we've done to address chronic disease hasn't really worked. So we need to blow all up those approaches and try radical things. So they're doing a whole lot of really amazing research in areas that, you know, I can't even begin to describe the number of different realms of their research, but one of their kind of hubs or whatever is about aging. So that's how I applied for this privately funded residency. It's now called the Judy Harris Fellowship, and it's funded by a single woman called Judy Harris, who incredibly generously gives $100,000 for one writer to work there for a year. And I was the first one, and now there have been sort of many, 3 or 4 since then. And it's just incredibly exciting, energetic place to be. And the only the only sort of requirement of the writer is first that they write the book, you know, go about writing the book. You don't have to finish it there or anything like that, but that you spend your time writing the book. And secondly, that you just connect with the scientists in whatever way happens organically. And that is, nobody gives you that freedom with money in the arts. You know, usually there's a whole lot of tied thing you have to teach, and you have to show people this, and you have to report against certain criteria. But because it's privately funded by one philanthropist, an amazing woman, you're just free from all of those strictures, and they trust you and they trust the creative process to do its thing. And so that's what happened. It was amazing.
How did that directly affect the writing of the weekend, do you think?
Well, the one really identifiable thing that did was give me Finn the dog in the book, because I was talking with a nutritional ecologist called David Robenheimer, whose work is in animal nutrition. And I was just chatting with him one day, and he said, fairly sort of formally and in a way I found a bit confronting, he said, well, I think you should put some evolutionary biology in your novel. And I was like, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. But because my job there was to be influenced, you know, to open up to whatever influence came my way, I didn't sort of shut down that conversation as I normally would in my own head. So I just sort of said, what do you mean? And he said, well, animal aging is much more accelerated than human aging. So how, you know, maybe it could be interesting to look at animal aging at the same time as the women in your book. And I thought, oh, that's actually a really interesting point, but I still didn't really know how I would go about that. And then, you know, within a few days, I realized that a good friend of mine's dog called Finn was doing exactly the things that Finn in the book does. It was dementing and, you know, just struggling with end of life stuff. And that dog dementia apparently very, you know, accurately mirrors human dementia. So this sort of vulnerability and dependence that the women in my book didn't want to think, you know, their characters are such that they're not interested in aging as a topic. Like, why would they even bother thinking about that? But Finn allowed me to pour all our cultural sort of anxieties into the dog.
Finn is certainly a major character in the story. We might get on to Finn a little bit more later.
Sure.
I'm sort of deliberately not trying to talk too much about the plot, because I think that's something that people can discover, really. But I did want to talk a little bit more about the characters, the friendship between the characters. That's sort of the other sort of major element, I suppose. The flaws in these women there are a lot of flaws. They're very flawed human beings, aren't they? And that's what makes them so attractive, I think.
Well, I'm glad you feel that way.
Well, they're like,
they are very
like us, so we feel comfortable because, you know, we're all a bit like that.
Yeah, I feel that way. I mean, I see them as very flawed. Quite a lot of people think they're really mean to each other, you know, and I don't know what I see them as very flawed people who are that way because they're very vulnerable. You know, they're kind of secretly vulnerable in a way that they can't admit to each other, because they have been these very powerful figures in their professional lives. And I did want to write about women who are not defined, older women particularly, who are not defined by family relationships, whose work was central to their ideas of who they are, who are almost kind of the first generation of women who are facing that retirement sort of terror that men have always faced, but women haven't had the chance to have that kind of very work-based identity until, you know, probably about this generation of women. Yeah. So the women in the book are in their 70s. So they, you know, they're also coming together at a time when they're very much in grief for their friend Sylvie, who's died. And they find that they're kind of lost to each other because they can't really, their friendship doesn't work properly without Sylvie. She was the one who kind of balanced the dynamic. She was the one who smoothed over their kind of scratchy edges. She was the one that they could each turn to and go, why is Adele behaving like that? Or, you know, Wendy's annoying me, and Sylvie would make it all right, you know.
So can I
so
just
they
ask
kind of romanticize her.
Sorry to interrupt, but I just wondered about Sylvie, because she comes and goes. She's the one of the four who's actually died, of course, and that's why they're there clearing out her house. What sort of person was Sylvie? We get little glimpses, perhaps, but what do you think she was like?
Well, I don't really know any more than you do, except that to me, Sylvie's really only interesting in what she reveals about them, because one of the things they do is they kind of romanticize her, you know. Now that she's died, they well, they each think that they were very close to Sylvie. You know, there's that sort of sense that they kind of each secretly think, well, we were all friends, but I was her best friend. You know, she and I understood each other. And if she was here, I would feel better. But they're kind of all thinking that, and they sort of make her into a bit of a saint now that she died. And you know, through the course of the book, and you know, I'm glad we won't talk about the plot, but you know, you discover things that they've had a lot of illusions about their own friendships and Sylvie and themselves. And I think that we do have that capacity to sort of sanctify people after they've died, which is not a bad thing. It's just because we love them. And often the kind of the trivial, annoying things just fall away because you miss the person so much. But
exactly. Yeah.
so Sylvie is a kind of bit of a cipher in the book, I suppose. And but their memories of her and their feelings about her kind of drive a lot of their sort of distress in the book.
And their relationship in the story doesn't remain static, of course. We're not going to say what happens, but a lot happens, and they learn a lot towards the end of the book. Things happen, you know. It's not just people sitting around talking to one another. There's what I sort of call perhaps a bit of character assassination going on between them, which is it's quite funny, some of it. I wonder if you could read that bit on page 145 for us, please, Bartlett. I thought it was a brilliant description.
Oh, yes. This was, so the women are Wendy, Jude and Adele, but they go out and they are confronted at a certain point by Sonia. So Adele is an actress and Sonia Dreyfus is her kind of professional nemesis. And she happens to be in the town at the same time and ends up coming to the house. Sonia's the one who gets all the good roles for any woman over the age of 50 in theatre in the city where they live. So anyway, Sonia's turned up at the house. It was surprising to Wendy how tiny Sonia was up close. She was a hairless little monkey, her mouth a thin line, drawn on eyebrows high and fine, and her pale skin stretched tight over her brow and cheekbones. Her skin was as mottled as ancient parchment. You could push a hole in it with the touch of a finger. Speaking of renditions of people being
laugh, but I certainly laughed.
Well, I wanted to write a funny book too, you know.
Well,
after,
you did. One of the questions I've noticed tonight is people asking about the humour, and we'll get onto those questions in a minute. Yes, I thought it was a very funny book too, and one of the constellations of aging, I think, is the humour around it. I don't know if you agree with that. You know, it's just a damn funny business getting old. The things that happen to you. If you don't laugh, you just, you know, you give up. So you may as well just laugh.
Yeah, but I think as you get older, you do have to let go of some sort of vanities and the illusion of control and all of that.
Right.
And, you know, I think some of the humour in the book comes from their different ideas of about their bodies. You know, Jude is very uptight and sort of is quite disgusted by any mention of bodily issues, whereas I think there's a memory of, I think it was Sylvie and Adele sort of listing to each other all the things that had gone wrong lately with their bodies, and Jude just sort of having to leave the room because she was so disgusted by, you know, even the mention of things bodily. So it's they're laughing at her, like, and they said, it's just bodies, Jude. You know, it's just our bodies. What's the problem? So, but these sort of clashes of personality and ideals are hopefully what drives some of the humour.
Now I've got loads more questions, but there's quite a few questions from our listeners, Q&A listeners. So perhaps we should just deal with some of those. Brian's got a question. When you were talking about your parents, his question was really asking how they supported each other. Is at that time, I presume he means at the time when they were separated, that first time, or sounds like they didn't really support each other, did they? Or they weren't able to, really. I'm not quite sure if that's what he means, or
how do they support each other in that time after? Oh, maybe they mean maybe it means financially. So he
Maybe if
left
he
the
was
monastery.
he was an ex-Trappist monk, and how did they support each other then?
Yeah,
Perhaps.
well, they had no money. They in
Imagine.
fact, my mother wrote to her parents. She said, "Oh, Mummy and Daddy, I've got some news. Um, I'm getting married to a monk, and he doesn't have any money. In fact, he only owns a pair of shoes, because of course when he joined the monastery, he had to give away all his worldly possessions, and he literally had nothing. So I'm not exactly sure how they, what they lived on, but I think she was asking her parents for a bit of money at that point. And then he got a job as a school teacher in the country, and she, I know, worked for a bit of time at Darrell Lea in Melbourne. And then she was a florist, my mother, but had never really worked as a florist in Australia until later on. But yeah, my dad became a school teacher very quickly. So if that was the kind of support we were talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I couldn't help thinking about your father being a Trappist monk, because they're noted for their silence. And I wondered whether you, as a writer, were compensating perhaps for his year of silence, or making up for it by writing.
Yeah, maybe. He once taught me this kind of sign language that they used to use. This sort of, I think, imagine it's very ancient,
Yes.
passed down through generations of sort of, they were allowed to speak, but only for matters of work, actual practical, where absolutely necessary. I think that's all relaxed now, but
Yeah.
it'd be still focus on contemplative.
That was their
Stuff.
idea.
I mean, I think being a writer, obviously it's giving voice to a whole lot of stuff, but there's also a lot of silence involved, in the
Yeah,
life.
you're a bit contemplative too. Yeah, you have to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a question from Margot too. Thanks, Margot. She's asking, how much of the structure of the book did you have in mind when you started writing? And did the editing process make any changes as you went along?
I guess the only structure I had was that I wanted it to be over Christmas, and I thought around 3 days, because I quite like that contained time frame, because I knew it was going to be a very sort of intimate sort of book, domestic book. I didn't want to, I'd just come from writing The Natural Way of Things, which is this kind of big picture sort of stuff about our culture and those sorts of ideas about power and politics and everything. And I wanted to just go very quiet and small and sort of based in a home in the middle class, and kind of, this sort of go to a more pleasant setting for a while. But when I've got a story like that in mind, I didn't know what was going to happen, but I knew that probably not very much was going to happen in terms of, hopefully a lot happens psychologically, and as you say, towards the end, things do sort of speed up and things do happen in the town. But that sort of drawing in the boundaries is very helpful for raising pressure and tension in the close quarters. So they're sort of putting them in the house together and then drawing in the boundaries of time. I kind of probably knew that from early on that would be useful to me. In the editing, there wasn't much change in that regard. There was a lot of rewriting about the timing of things and where they went around the town, and I had diagrams of where this was in the town and where the house was and where they were in the house and all that sort of stuff. But structurally, it's a fairly simple book, I think, probably.
Was that the containment thing's quite Agatha Christie, isn't it? That sort of containment in keeping, so people can't sort of stray too far.
Yeah,
you keep a bit of control of the plot too.
Yeah, it's a very well established trope. I guess quite often in television and film, it's a filmmaker friend of mine said that's why you always have TV shows set in police stations or hospitals, or a single place where people who don't necessarily get along are forced to be together, because that's when you get pressure and
the natural tension. Yeah. We were talking about the humour before, and Deb's got a question about saying the weekend is funny. and I agree with her.
Oh,
How
good.
did you go about making the shift to incorporating humour into this book as compared with many of your others?
Thank you, Deb. Well, I guess I started out thinking I want to write something funny. I want to have fun with it, especially when it's a topic that, I mean, a lot of people go, oh God, I can't believe you're writing about such sad stuff about aging and death. And I'm kind of like, I'm not even really writing about death. It's just that when we think of aging, we think we're going off a cliff into death. Obviously, you know, the older you get, the closer you are. But then again, you know, I've lived with the idea of death since I was 19 and my dad died, and I'd live with the feeling that this can happen any minute, you know,
Yes.
like
Yeah.
any minute. So, but I loved doing the funny stuff. I found it so joyful for myself as a writer, and I loved the idea of pleasing a couple of my writer friends. You know, putting little presents for them in there that I knew they would particularly, you know, respond to in a way, you know, by laughing. But you know, my book Animal People, I hoped was also quite funny, although I'm not sure. You know, it's that thing where you think, I think it's funny, but you don't know what other people think is funny, really.
That's the
So
trouble.
I'm really glad, Deb, that
A
you
lot
thought
of
it was
people
funny.
thought, yeah, a lot of people thought this was funny. Yeah.
Right.
There's a question from Jo too. She's comment is that I felt like there's a lot of regret or dissatisfaction with life from the characters in the weekend, and she's asking if this was intentional.
Okay, sorry, I was just trying to find that question too. Yeah, well, there's certainly dissatisfaction with life, but sort of with moments of life. I think they've had quite good lives on the whole, but they have a lot of illusions about the way they've lived their lives. So Jude, for example, we know from the very start that she's been having a 40-year relationship with a married man, and she sees that as perfectly fine, and she sort of claims it for herself as a kind of freedom and independence, that she's never asked him for anything. She's lived her life as a independent person, which gives her a sort of strength and power and all of that. And then, you know, gradually you see that there's this other kind of realization creeping through her feelings about that she doesn't really allow herself to look at, and that, you know, it's she's actually very vulnerable. She's given over her life to this man without ever really getting very much back, but she can't allow herself to think that way, because if she does, then what has her life been, you know? Wendy's very focused on the book that she's writing and her academic work, and that she's got actually her major breakthrough work is yet to come. Her kind of struggles are about Finn, the dog who she adores, who she can't bear to let go, because, you know, other people are telling her all the time that he's got to be put down, he's sick, he's old, he's not, you know, but she thinks he's not in pain and she loves him and she can't let that go. And Adele doesn't really have a lot of regrets. She too wants, her main regret is that she's just realized that her girlfriend is actually breaking up with her, and that means Adele's going to have nowhere to live, and she's got no money because she's been an actress, a stage actress forever, and which anyone who works in the arts, and you know, right now, my God, the instability of income for arts workers, particularly performers, is kind of terrifying. And she has a kind of urgency of needing to get some work, but also not just for money, but for her own self-expression, for her, the idea of herself comes from her work, and she knows that she's good and she's got more to offer. And I think the kind of regret that is there is these women feeling just so frustrated that people seem to think they don't have more really important work to do. And they have been kind of slow to catch on to this idea that the world is kind of edging them out, but they're not ready to be edged out. So, yeah, I don't feel like they're full of regret. I mean, I think at the end they've had to realize some very, very hard things about themselves. but I hope that there is also a hopeful feeling about that.
Thanks for that, Charlotte. Lisa's asking, well, she's saying that she's working on a book club for women who don't have children, and there are so few fiction novels that address this. She loved The Weekend for the fact that childless women were more prevalent. Was this intentional, she's asking?
Oh, thanks, Lisa. I guess it was intentional in that sense that I didn't want them defined by being mothers, because I think that's what a lot of our cultures, especially looking at older women in, you know, if it's television or in books, they're often mothers or grandmothers, and they're sort of static, and their family is the driving force of their life, even if it's not a altogether happy one. Whereas for a lot of my friends and me, I don't have children, and probably maybe about half and half of my friends do and don't have, my female friends do and don't have children. But I was keen to look at, it's kind of like a cautionary self-portrait, this book. I'm thinking, what kind of women will we be when we're 75? So now I'm 50, turning 55 soon. And in 20 years, how do I want to be? So the childless aspect was probably because, you know, a lot because I'm childless, but also I think women have changed a lot, you know, in the last 50 years. There's been radical change for women. And I wanted these women to be thinking about the changes that have happened in their life, and the changes they are still changing. You know, they're not static in the way that we think old people are just sort of sit there, you know, remembering the past. And I didn't want that. So I guess it was deliberate, really, yeah, but not about childlessness per se, but about sort of independent, work-focused women.
Well, they're very vital women, aren't they?
Yeah, they're vital in different ways. They're certainly, character-wise, they're extremely vital. Physically, they kind of go across the range. So Adele is incredibly fit and healthy and she really enjoys her body. You know, she's got these great boobs that were always her great famous asset as an actress. And she does Pilates, and she runs up and down the stairs of this place where the other women are like, it's like, you know, 5 flights of stairs. That's why they've got the inclinator, which I realized that people in Melbourne and Victoria maybe don't know about inclinators, because they're kind of like a little mini monorail that goes up a very steep block. There's a lot of them on the coast north of Sydney, because a lot of houses are built kind of right into these very steep cliffs. So a lot of these kind of wealthy houses have inclinators where you put stuff on a platform and you press a button and you climb the hill. And this one in this house is a very rickety, rusty old inclinator, which hopefully also adds to a bit of the humour. Why did I get started on inclinators? I don't know. Sorry, I've lost it.
Let's move on. We've got some more questions, so we better keep moving on them. Sue's saying, do you really think relationships and friendships can recover when people have to confront difficult realities? And she says, I loved your observations of these different women and the circumstances, all recognisable in bits of people we know. And I was just thinking the same thing then when you were talking. We do recognise these women, don't we?
Oh, I'm glad if you do. Yeah, that question of whether we can resolve really big confrontations with our friends, I obviously like to think that we can. I think one of the things about this book is about how sometimes it's your friends who deliver you the really big shocks to your self-image. And that's what happens to these women. And it's very hard. The grief of losing friendships is extreme, I have found in my life. And I don't think it's ever really talked about in the way that the grief of losing, you know, of breaking up, you know, romantic partners. Friendship breakups can be utterly devastating. And, you know, they have a lot to lose. If they lose each other, they have a lot to lose, these women, especially at this time of their lives. I had, there was several years ago in my life, there was a kind of friendship bust up, and one friend was talking to some people she knew about whether she would end this particular friendship. And her friends, and these are women in their 60s, and her friend said, but this is no time to be losing our friends. We need our friends now more than ever. And I thought that's a really beautiful point. But it means that we then have to stay really flexible and really open as we get older, which is very hard. One book that I read while I was writing this was a book called The Force of Character by James Hillman. I always get his name wrong. Yes, it is James Hillman. I'll show it to you. Good that you can do this in Zoom, isn't it?
There it is.
And he was a Jungian sort of analyst and writer, and he talks about that the purpose of human aging is to become our essential real selves and to fulfill our essential character. And I love that idea. And he talks about you can consider aging as an art form, which I really love. But so I love this idea of each of us as we get older, fulfilling becoming our essential true self. And then I thought, but what does that mean for friendship? When we need to be, good friendship requires a certain amount of malleability and porosity and ability to change your view and reverse your position and all of that. So that, I guess, were the tensions at play for me thematically in this book were, how do you stay a good friend and yet remain your real self or become your real self? Because sometimes change in a friendship is very threatening if one person changes, it can be very threatening to their friend or vice versa. And so I think that's just an eternal tussle. Yeah. And I think friendships can survive that, but I don't think friendships are static. I think they really change, and you have to allow them to change. Otherwise, they just sort of go dead. And then you go through the motions. But
they're probably not real friendships in the real sense, are they? If nothing happens, if it's just being nice all the time, no growth probably. Look, we've got some more questions. Lots more questions there. Jacinta's asking if you read for enjoyment too, and which authors you enjoy reading.
Oh my God, I read for everything. Of course I read for enjoyment. I read for instruction. I read for inspiration. I read, I live by reading in a way. So many favorite authors. Let me turn to my bookshelf. Elizabeth Strout, of course, is one of my favorites. Elizabeth Strout, Anne Enright, the Irish writer, is just dynamite. Actually, I've recently just fallen in love with an American writer called Joan Silber, who is just phenomenal. She's been writing for a long time, but I'd always heard her name as one of those sort of writer, but I'd never read her until recently. And then just I met her at the Adelaide Writers Festival just before the pandemic hit, and bought all of the books that I could find there of hers, and then ordered 3 more online. So I've been having a big Joan Silber phase, and I think she's just fantastic. To name a very few.
I've got another Charlotte saying how wonderful it is to hear about your books and life stories. And she's wondering about advice for aspiring writers, especially in terms of pitching their novels. This question could take all night to answer, perhaps.
Yeah. I didn't quite get that. In terms of pitching their novels, did you say?
Yes, she's wondering what advice you might have for aspiring writers when they come in to pitch their novels to publishers, I imagine.
Yes. Well, I think the best way to go about that is to try and get yourself a good agent. And that can be really difficult, I know, but an agent will have the conversations that are really hard to have about your own work. Like they can have arguments with publishers about money, and they can just be on your side in a way that's really, really useful. So there are lists of agents in the Agents Association or something that are good, but also connect with other writers in writing centres, writing associations, people, other writers on social media or whatever. And then writers really help each other, and find your tribe, I guess, as a writer is a really good thing. I've actually got a little podcast called The Writer's Room. And the second episode of that, I think, is me talking with my friend Tegan Bennett Daylight about finding your creative tribe, and what having writing friends, the importance of that, because that is more important than finding a publisher in a way, because they're the ones who will keep you going. And also share knowledge and experience and contacts and all of that, and help you. But really the main thing is concentrate on the writing more than the pitching to the publisher. Like, make it the best book you can make it, then think about publishing, because it's really the writing that, it sounds kind of romantic, but good writing will out, good writing will get you there more than any contact or course or networking, whatever. Just write the best book you can write first.
You mentioned the Writer's Room podcast that you do. That was one of my later questions. Perhaps it's something that people might want to have a look at too. Can you just say a little bit about what you do with those, and people can look them up online, can't they?
Yes, they can. It's on Apple Podcasts. It's called The Writer's Room with Charlotte Wood, just because there's lots of writers' rooms out there. And I named it The Writer's Room because I put together a book a few years ago of interviews that I had done with writers, which I basically did as a kind of little masterclass for myself, to pick other writers' brains about the way they worked. And that was a huge amount of work. I had it as a kind of online magazine, and then we turned it into a book. And it was a huge amount of work doing a print thing, because transcribing interviews and editing and all of that. So when I had the idea of doing a pod, because I really started missing those conversations, because they're quite kind of conversations that you don't really have with when you interviewed by journalists and things. You're always asked about the content of the book, not how you do it. So these are conversations between writers about the how of working. And actually I branched out to start looking at other artists as well. So the episode at the moment is an interview with a fantastic actress called Heather Mitchell, who's a very well-known stage actress here in New South Wales. Anyway, I'm sure she's worked in Melbourne, but and on film and stuff, about character, about creating character. But other ones have been about writing memoir, or and the cross-pollination of different art forms and how that influences writers, and so on. So I think I've got 6 episodes up now, and you can get it on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, or if you go to my website, there's a link. There's a podcast page, and you can listen to it there, or you can get it on your phone or whatever, wherever you listen to podcasts. It's really fun.
Look, I've discovered them, and I really suggest, we're going to have to wind up. I suggest that people go and have a look at the Writer's Room podcast. Obviously, there's more questions tonight, and I've got more questions too. And our time is really coming to an end. Really just get going.
Thank you, Ryan.
The Writer's Room podcast, is a place to go, I think, tonight. But look, we do have to wrap it up, unfortunately, this evening. So I'd like to thank you, Charlotte, for a wonderful discussion tonight. I've thoroughly enjoyed it myself, and I hope everybody else has, the other 89 people who are listening to us tonight. And just remind people. Sorry.
I love that. And sorry, right, just before we go, Ryan, who says, I think Jude was misunderstood and didn't seize the opportunities in her life. I love that. Yes, you're right. She should have.
End on the note of being misunderstood. But, look,
and thank you, John. That was wonderful.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Now, Charlotte's book is available from the library, of course, as a hard copy, and also as an ebook version. And of course, available in lots of bookshops. So please go out and buy The Weekend. And also, this webinar will be available tomorrow from the library website. So please have another look and send it to people that haven't had a chance to listen to tonight. And while you're on the website too, check out some of the other libraries' events coming up. Next Wednesday night, we've got Page 2 discussing her latest book, The Minute I Saw You. And there's plenty more lovely writers like Charlotte coming on in the coming weeks. So on behalf of the library, thank you, Charlotte, and thank you all very much tonight for listening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.